the nightmare everyone imagines. 1,000 years of Nazi rule, permanent, orderly, unshakable, is the one part of this that almost certainly wouldn't have happened. Not because the war would have gone better for the other side, because of what was actually written down in the regime's own planning documents about what came next. First, a correction, because the premise usually gets exaggerated before the conversation even starts. There was no realistic path to Germany conquering the entire planet. That version belongs in fiction. The United States alone built more tanks and aircraft during the war than the rest of the Axis powers combined. No invasion fleet was crossing the Atlantic to occupy that. The plausible version historians actually study is narrower, and in some ways it's scarier for being so much closer to what really happened. That narrower version is the one worth taking seriously, precisely because it was within reach, not because it was inevitable. Knock the Soviet Union out of the war, force Britain to a negotiated peace, keep the United States from fully entering. That's the version worth taking seriously. And it was a near miss, not a fantasy. Moscow, December 1941. German units were within artillery range of the city before the counteroffensive pushed them back. A handful of different weather windows, fuel shipments, or command decisions in the preceding months, and that offensive plausibly succeeds. Historians still argue over exactly how close it came. Nobody serious argues it wasn't close, so suppose it happens. The Soviet government falls or sues for peace. Britain, isolated, eventually negotiates rather than fights alone. What does the resulting Europe actually look like for the people living in it? Not a guess. There's a document, General Plan Ost, drafted from 1940 to 1940 to 1942 under Heinrich Himmler's office for the resettlement of the conquered East. Its own text, in its own words, states that many tens of millions of people in that territory would become superfluous and would have to die or be pushed further east. The plan's own projections targeted the removal of roughly 31 million people directly. Full implementation over 25 to 30 years is estimated by historians to have cost somewhere between 30 and 60 million lives, mostly through engineered starvation. That starvation had its own name, too. The Hunger Plan. Its explicit purpose was to redirect food from occupied Soviet territory to Germany and let the resulting famine kill tens of millions of what the plan itself called surplus population. Poland's population was to be reduced by roughly 80 to 85%, most of Belarus, most of the Baltic states. This isn't speculation about what might have happened. It's a description of what was already being drafted, funded, and in places actively started, while the war was still being fought. So the honest, documented answer to what a one war would have looked like is not stability. It's the largest engineered famine in human history, by design, on paper, with a name. And this is where the counterfactual actually gets interesting, because here's what the fantasy version always leaves out. The regime capable of drafting that plan was, at the exact same time, almost comically bad at running anything as one coherent system. Historians have a term for how Nazi Germany actually functioned day to day: polycracy. Rule by competing, overlapping power centers, deliberately left to fight each other. Himmler's SS ran its own parallel economy, its own armies, its own colonization schemes. Göring ran a separate industrial empire. Bormann controlled access to Hitler himself and used that chokehold as a weapon against the other two. Speer's war production ministry was constantly at war with all three, just to get raw materials allocated rationally. Historian Ian Kershaw has a phrase for how Hitler actually ruled through all of this, working towards the Führer. Hitler set vague, grandiose goals and mostly stepped back. Subordinates competed to guess what he wanted and deliver it first, each trying to outdo the others in radicalism to win his favor. That system is extraordinarily effective at generating atrocities quickly. It is a terrible system for running a stable government for decades. Historians still argue over how much of this chaos was deliberate design and how much was simply Hitler's own disinterest in the boring, unglamorous work of administration. Either explanation lands in the same place. Nobody was actually steering the machine toward a stable, governable outcome. There was no unified chain of command in the conquered East. There were 4 or 5, actively undermining each other. with Hitler refereeing by mood rather than by policy. Now add the economics, and the picture gets worse for the fantasy of a stable empire, not better. The domestic Nazi economy ran substantially on loot, confiscated property, extracted resources, and requisitioned food from occupied territory, used specifically to keep German civilians from being taxed or rationed too heavily. That system needs a constant supply of new territory to strip. It has no functioning off switch, stop conquering, and the machine that was feeding the German home front starts running out of fuel. A finished war was never actually compatible with this economic model. There's also the simple, unglamorous problem of holding the ground once you have it. Even in the real, actual war, partisan resistance across the occupied Soviet territories tied down enormous numbers of German troops just on internal security, far from any front line. A version of General Plan Ost's policies, deliberately starving and displacing tens of millions of people, would not have pacified that resistance. Historians studying the plan generally agree it would have guaranteed decades of exactly the opposite. An occupation that requires a permanent, continent-sized security operation just to survive isn't a stable empire. It's a standing drain on the exact manpower and resources the system needed to function at all, which connects to something the fantasy also leaves out entirely. This was never supposed to be the end state. German naval planning under what was called Plan Z and long-range bomber programs aimed explicitly at reaching the continental United States were already in early development before the war even properly started. A dominated Europe wasn't the final goal in Nazi planning. It was staging ground for a later war against America, expected sometime in the 1940s or 1950s. So even total victory in Europe wasn't the finish line the fantasy imagines. It was a pause before round two. And then there's the succession problem, which on its own is enough to unravel the whole picture. Hitler built no functioning mechanism for what happens after him, none. His most powerful lieutenants, Himmler, Göring, Bormann, Goebbels, despised each other and had spent over a decade building private rival power bases specifically to compete for exactly this moment. Most historians studying the question conclude some kind of succession crisis, quite possibly violent, was the likely outcome the moment Hitler died or was removed. There's precedent for exactly that kind of internal violence too, and it happened years before any of this. In 1934, Hitler had dozens of his own rivals inside the movement, killed in a single purge to settle an internal power struggle. A regime that had already solved one internal rivalry with mass killing had no obvious reason to solve the next one any differently. So put the honest picture together, built entirely from documents the regime wrote about itself. An empire actively planning the deliberate starvation of tens of millions of people, on paper, with a name and a budget, run by competing warlords who agreed on almost nothing except loyalty to one man, funded by a looting economy that couldn't survive peace, aimed even at its own moment of total victory, at yet another war still to come, with no plan whatsoever for what happens after its only source of authority dies. That is not the thousand-year Reich of the popular imagination. It's something closer to an engine built entirely for conquest, incapable of doing anything else, that would very plausibly have started tearing itself apart the moment the conquering stopped. The truly frightening version of this isn't a stable, eternal tyranny. It's the staggering, well-documented scale of what it would have inflicted while it lasted, on its way to almost certainly failing anyway. Which leaves a real and slightly uncomfortable question about how history like this should even be studied. One position: dig into the internal documents in this kind of detail, however grim, because understanding exactly how a system like this actually functioned is what makes it recognizable if the pattern starts forming again. The other position, dwelling this closely on the mechanics, risks something else entirely: turning a genuine atrocity into a piece of content, a thought experiment, entertainment with a body count attached. Study the machinery in this much detail, or is that itself the wrong way to sit with something like this? Tell me where you land, and tell me why. Because somewhere there is still a document, drafted by real people, in real ministries, with a real name and a real number attached to it. And the most unsettling thing about it was never that it might have worked. It's that they wrote it down anyway, certain, for a while, that it would.
If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is for.
Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.